Lina Ivanova, and I am co-founder of Revolv Collective. We are honoured to have curated this year's edition of Photo50. The exhibition is called Grafting, the Land and the Artist. And today I am joined and co-chairing this talk with Victoria Louise Doyle, also part of Revolv Collective. And we are joined by three of our exhibiting artists, Hannah Fletcher, Joshua Bilton and Rowan Lear. And we are really excited to have this opportunity to unpick themes and ideas that have been explored through the works in the exhibition, but also by these three artists. The talk is called Unlearning with the Land. And to start, I guess I'll talk a little bit about my relationship both with the land and learning. I come from Bulgaria originally, and my relationship with the land actually started from a very young age, spending my holidays in rural Bulgaria, helping my grandparents look after the land, live off the land in Bulgaria. And I guess that's transitioned. I moved to the UK with my family in 2007, and that's kind of been a constant throughout my life, looking after the land, growing things, and that's kind of how I guess I've stayed connected to my roots. And photography came in during my university years when I was going back to Bulgaria to document that way of living. And my practice over the last few years has moved towards sculpture and installation, and expanded in a way where I'm interested in the photograph as an imprint, and working with clay and creating casts. And then learning came through, I guess, starting or my relationship to learning outside of university started with co-founding the collective back in 2017, where learning was kind of a process of continuous practice development, learning with each other through sharing experience, and kind of being each other's mentors in a way. And over the last few years, that's expanded through workshops that we do, and in informal settings, but also at universities. And I also teach in a secondary school art and photography, so a much more formal and, I guess, more monitored in a way setting. So anyway, that's kind of, and with Vicky over the last few years, we've been a lot in conversation about our experience in those contexts, and have collaborated loads. So we thought that this would be a really good opportunity for us to unpick themes, ideas, and ways of working. So I'm going to pass over to Vicky to talk about
Thank you, Lina.
her relationship to...
Yeah, so also very engaged in learning. Little known fact, Lina played an instrumental role in developing some of my approaches to teaching and education. I'm incredibly grateful to have been able to spend time with you and to develop and learn from you. I love photography, I'm obsessed by it. And for me, photography is something to learn through. I'm autistic, and one of the things that photography has enabled me to do is grapple with subjects I otherwise wouldn't be able to understand or gain access to. So I don't know about my relationship with the land. I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this talk, to learn a little bit more about how the land can impact and affect our learning and unlearning practices, but also our teaching practices. So I'd like to hand over to Hannah, who is our first artist.
Okay, so for those of you that have been upstairs to the exhibition already or are planning to go afterwards, just to contextualize visually where I am within that space. I have 3 works in the space, a sculpture, which we can see on the screen now, called Reclamation. This was my first kind of big move into working much more sculpturally and much more physically as well, I guess. I mean, I always work very physically with photographic materials, but it's a very different relationship when you're working with metal and when you're working with, you know, the weight and also the kind of complexity of these weighty materials. So I learned how to weld last year, and I built this basically steel diamond, which has a jug of photographic fixer sat above it. The fixer drips through a tube, which I can alternate the kind of rate of. And as the fixer drips over the sculpture, what takes place is a reclamation process. So the silver particles, which are held within used photographic fixer, get attached to the steel in the diamond, and in place of the silver in the fixer, the steel takes its place, or the iron, because it's a high carbon steel. So what is falling to the tray at the bottom, which is an old photographic tray, is a lower toxicity solution than what was in the jug above. So this work is really designed to represent some of the research that both I'm doing and my wider community is doing. So I run a research organisation called Sustainable Darkroom, where we look at kind of researching low toxicity and more environmentally entwined ways to work with analog photography. This piece was kind of quite a challenge to both figure out the logistics of, but also think about how we represent something which is both designed to be in a setting where people are looking at aesthetic and you want to draw people in and you want to visually engage people, but also how does the work still do the job that it's meant to do? How is it still something practical and is not just a showcase and kind of a pretend, or, you know, not physically doing what it's, you know, says on the tin, if you like. So really balancing, and I think quite a lot of my work does that, is balancing the kind of artistic with the practical solutions, and it being something usable and workable and tangible in, you know, how we work as artists and how we function in these spaces. So the other works I have in the space I'll quickly talk about are these pinholes, which were made in collaboration with one of my co-directors, Alice Kaznav. So these were made on a remote island called Uro, and they were developed in a low toxicity developer that we made using our old tea bags after we drunk tea on the island, basically, and then they were fixed in salt that we evaporated from the Baltic Sea. So we went to this island for a month to basically figure out how could we make images from the limited resources that a remote island has to offer. And when I say remote, I mean it only has 2 permanent residents living on the island. You can walk around it easily in a day. It's 2 kilometers by 3 kilometers big. There are no shops. A ferry comes once a week where you can maybe order some groceries, and that's about it. So we took some simple materials with us to get us started, but that kind of space, really being within a landscape and thinking very minutely about, you know, what is on offer and what's not there, I think really expands the way you think about your materials and what you can work with. So we were evaporating down the seawater in order to make our fixer, which I actually have some of here. So this is the Baltic sea salt that we evaporated down, that we then used to fix our prints with. So it really becomes, the images become so intertwined with the land because both the materials become of the land as well as the subject matter becoming of the land. So I think they're really interesting to come into the conversation today because you can see them both as a process of learning with the land as well as unlearning with the land, because you might assume that things are going to react a certain way and actually they do something completely different because the land is unpredictable. You know, plants which grow in one area will have a completely different chemistry to a plant growing somewhere else because the land is different. And because, you know, the makeup and the chemistry and the physicality of each of those spaces is so unique. And so for me, what's amazing in working in this way is that you're always humbled by the materials and by the land that you're working in, because, you know, we can't just rely on something being the same like we do when we go and buy it from a shop. We're not guaranteed that it's going to be the same product. So it's both challenging, but also I think incredibly rewarding to work in this way, and it completely changes your outlook of what you're working with. And then here's just an up close of one of the pinholes. So, you know, there was very limited, I guess, subject matter on the island, but that didn't matter. It was mostly rocks and trees. And because of the, so I'll just explain, the cameras that we were using to take these images were old 35mm canisters, so the black plastic pots that you get 35mm film in, because we'd brought some film with us. So, you know, that made the perfect setup for a small camera that we could make. They're already black in the inside, so we didn't need any paint. They're really small, so you would make like 8, and we'd just take them out on a walk around the island and shoot all these little plastic canisters and then bring them back and develop them. Because of the curvature of the pot, it acts a bit like a fisheye, so you get this kind of expanded, slightly warped view of the landscape, and that's why the tree looks like it's kind of bending and the rocks come up. A lot of my work also thinks about how we can give back to the places we're working in, and how it can not just be a one-dimensional relationship. So we, after coming back from the island, we kind of collated all of the research that we'd done while we were there, and we made a zine, which I have some copies of here as well. And it's also up in the show if you want to have a look through it. So this was really a way of us thinking, okay, how can we give back to the people, you know, that whose land this is? We're not Finnish, and we don't have the same relationship with the land as the people there, and so how can this be something of benefit to them and not just artists coming into their space, you know, taking for a month and doing what they want to do and then leaving, and that not seeing any kind of long-term or larger relationship than that. So we made all of the processes that we were using and all of the, you know, recipes and techniques that we did available in this publication to hand out to the locals, so that they could be more involved and understand what we were doing, and also have then a resource that was, you know, available for future people who came to the island or are generally working in that the kind of archipelago region of Finland. So that's an example of the inside. It was Rizzo printed using two-tone color and just staple bound. Very simple resource. So yeah, now I'll pass over to Josh to explain his work.
Okay, thanks, Anna. I guess with all of my work, it always involves community in a sense. I think that's been for the last 7 years, and I always consider that a process of kind of unlearning in a way. That you go there with an idea, and then often through the process of collaboration, those ideas are challenged by the community group, which is brilliant. That's kind of what you want to happen, so that you're not kind of operating in this kind of isolated bubble. This work would be a sort of strong example of that. That it really started as a project that was suggested as a kind of 2-year project, which is sort of amazing. You rarely get someone saying to you, right, the Canal and River Trust approached me. They said, we want you to work with a school, a primary school, and we're looking at this project sort of lasting for 2 years. And we're interested really in how you might engage that school with the local canal, how you might establish a sense of kind of educational processes that bring them outside to engage with that space, and how you might also create a sort of resource that's left with them that they can continue to use. So I really resonate with what sort of Hannah's saying about starting a process that's about making, but it's also about creating something which is of benefit to that community that can also be sustained and used in the future. So out of this project, or this commission, came the project Seed Pod. And I'll be honest, I went into the primary school initially, and I had the first session, and the teacher was there, and I thought, wow, like, I'm really, like, this is great. Like, they're listening to me, everything's going really well, it's not too difficult. I'd mostly taught kind of at university or that level, so I was thinking, right, I'm fully in control of this. And then the teacher said, oh, next session I have to go, and it would just be you and the TA, and it was very different. I suddenly realized, like, the way I was going in there was needed a much more planned out structure, and for the children to feel more contained and have some kind of boundaries. So straight away there's a process of learning there. And quite quickly, I started to read or share with them bits of poetry. We talked a lot about the canal, and what I found was that nature became this thing that was quite difficult for them to access if we just talked about it factually, or we talked about information about nature. But it became something they really related to if it dealt with what we might call animism, this idea of animating the landscape, or talking about the landscape as something living. So in that sense, they began to sort of become water themselves, or they began to experience what it might be like to be a tree, or what it might be like to construct and make a ceramic seed, and then take that seed on a walk and throw it into the water and let it kind of break down in the water. So we dealt with sort of physical processes which are about embodying nature in that sense. See if the clicker works. Out of that came this sort of educational resource called Seed Pod, and this consists of poetry and stories written by the children. It consists of Polaroids, ceramic seeds that they've made as well. And it also consists of small rituals and various processes that they went through during this 2-year project. I think the kind of thing that was key for me within that was I also realized within an education system, particularly within school, there's not so much free time given to children. So this idea that they had this 2-hour session where we came in and we just did drawing, or we invented characters that were based on trees, or characters that were based on seeds or water creatures, I realized that that was quite unusual. And I think that became something that I sort of carried away from that. I was like, within a very rigorous and structured education model for children, actually free time to say, hey, let's go out, let's walk along the canal, let's take a blanket, we'll all you'll get underneath the blanket and you'll imagine what it's like to be invisible. And then you'll talk about what you can hear, and you'll totally experimental. but they absolutely embraced it. And I think that was that was maybe an unlearning and learning through the land, is actually the importance of both education in the classroom, but also getting children out to experience things through the kind of landscape they're in. That was something that just wasn't kind of happening there. These are some more images of the works themselves. This leads me on to the next work that I have in the exhibition, and that's called 67 Laments. 67 Laments was a project that I began when I did a residency at a place called Hogchester Arts, and I'd contacted Brendan Shields, who was in charge of the rewilding site there, and he had been working on that site with what you call mist nets and bird ringing. It basically means you set up a big net, and birds on their migration route, they fly into that net. So it sounds quite brutal in its actual process. They fly into that net, you then take them out of the net, and you inspect them, you check their wingspan, you check various different details, and you put a small ring on their leg if the bird already doesn't have one. And this is a method that's existed for many, many years, that basically helps us monitor migration routes, bird populations. But it's also a monitor for global and environmental concerns, because if we take the route of a certain bird going not just through Britain, but over to Africa, through Europe, across many different countries, you start to realize that the environmental impacts that are happening in those countries also begin to impact how that bird settles or lands back in the UK as well. So I kind of spoke to Brendan and learned a lot about that actual process and what it meant environmentally. And in 1995, there were reported, I think, about 35 birds on the endangered list. And today we're at 70. And this is a gradual increase based on the different environmental concerns we're facing. When I was making this work, there were 67. So the work was called 67 Laments, and it was really a kind of recognition at that very point in time of the numbers of birds that were considered endangered or to be kind of on that route to extinction. And for the work, I really wanted to focus right in on the hand, on Brendan's hand, and the very kind of intricate process of handling each bird, and what that relationship kind of meant, what it symbolized, and the message it kind of shared about the role the human hand plays in both protecting and holding, but also the huge role we're having to face now in the role that it plays in destruction, in actually destroying things. So the work really reflects on that through this 16mm loop, which is kind of like a circulation, and also has this relationship to magic as something is both appearing and disappearing. And we have to kind of accept that as some things disappear, they might not be able to be brought back. And I'll just briefly mention about this work, which is clay cast of two hands touching. In a way, this is a cast that I made of two hands in contact. It's about kind of an act of prolonging or holding a moment of contact between the skin. Sort of very poetical beginning to that work. Originally it was a cast. I then photographed the cast and then destroyed the cast. So the only thing that kind of exists of that is this photograph of the cast. So it deals with this sort of process of removal, and also a real engagement with kind of the role the photograph plays in memory, and holding on to that. Okay, I think I'm going to end there and pass it on to you, Rowan.
I'll do my best. Thanks. Okay, I think there's lots of really lovely resonances coming out between our works. I'm going to be a little bit brief, but I'm sure we'll come back to some of these things in the questions. This work that's in the exhibition is called A Sudden Branching, and it came out of a period of residency that was around 3 months in a kind of location in rural Scotland. I guess it's called Highland Perthshire, this area. And I wanted to just maybe bring us back to that moment at the beginning of 2021, when we had sort of COVID lockdowns and lots of things going on, which affected how I was making work at that time, or how I was able to make work. And one thing was that I'm so used to working collectively and so used to working in groups and in a very participatory way. And of course, that's the one thing that was really not possible at that time. I also found myself in this like really quite isolated location. I was living off grid in essentially a hut or a shed. I didn't have electricity. It was also really deep snow at that time. It was like very, very, bad winter. So the work comes out of this moment of actually sitting with myself, being kind of back in this hyper-local kind of place where my concerns for at least a month were, how do I get enough wood to keep myself warm tonight, like in these kind of freezing temperatures. And the residency went on to be much more kind of involved with other people. But I think this moment of like actually sitting with myself, with, I guess, the trees that I needed for my survival. And like, I guess I was reading quite a lot of books as well. So it's kind of like slightly solitary, just, working out what I'm doing actually as an artist, what is my practice. And the point of the residency was to work with my dad in a kind of more conscious way than I had been doing over the last, I guess, 20 years. My dad grows fruit trees for a living, so a practice he does yearly is grafting fruit trees, hence the name of the show. So he's essentially a tree farmer. And in those dormant periods, where the winter, when the trees are not growing, that's actually when you would cut budwood and bench graft trees. So my aim was to work with my dad, in part because I was super interested in, he has this kind of very embodied knowledge of how to do this work. He's been doing it a long time. It's not a kind of knowledge you can really learn in a book. You can read books about it, but I was interested in what I could inherit from my dad and how I would inherit that by working with him. And this, maybe I'll move on to show, it doesn't quite work in sequence of what I'm going to say, but in any case. One of the things that you do when you're grafting, particularly if you're grafting in the field, I would work behind my dad. He would be going forward and he would be cutting the trees, cutting a little hole and then putting in the bud graft, and then he would move on and then I would sort of follow him and tie up the bud graft, and that seals the wound and essentially makes it possible for a new tree to grow from a rootstock. And I was watching my dad do it so fast, so deftly. He's on his knees, like moving, he's really bent, he's like sort of doing this thing, moving forward. Obviously I cannot keep up with him at all, I'm miles behind him. And I'm so interested in how his body in many ways was like, had embodied this like way of working in the land and his way of working with another species or another type of being. And it's something that I was not going to be able to learn very quickly, and it was going to take time. And so that's maybe connecting a little bit to the shapes that occur in this exhibition. Super interested in photography as an embodied practice as well, and a type of movements that photography produces in our bodies, and wanting to relate that to plant life itself and how plants also, you talked about being like a tree. This idea of like how you might be like a tree, or actually working in the land makes you become more tree-like in some ways, more flexible, more protrusive, if that's the word, I don't know. More like audacious also in the ways that you move your body. So as you can probably tell, the photographs are on the, you can't tell, but the photographs are on the underneath of these shelves. If you've seen it in person, you'll know that you have to bend, you have to turn, you have to twist your neck to try and see the images. And so this work, maybe just going to skip past the images just now, this work is really designed to try and bring that movement and that embodiedness into the gallery space, I don't know if it's successful or not, but I'm really delighted whenever I see someone kind of doing a little bend to try and see this work. Maybe I'll talk more about the process and questions, but I should say like ceramic work, which I've been working with for a long time, and I was really interested in how to apply this kind of technique of grafting. So this is a whip and tongue graft, and I thought about how that might relate to clay and how you might be able to join clay using these techniques that are kind of tried and tested and very like ancient essentially. And so that's kind of where the ceramics idea came from. And then just to say that the original installation was part of this art centre called Burnham Arts. It had this really long, kind of long gallery space. So what we're seeing in the show here is a kind of like maybe more focused and concentrated version of that work. But I hope it like holds something still of that like maybe wildness like of the body and of the tree that has been grafted. I think I'll stop there. Pass back to you guys.
Thank you so much to all three of you for sharing a bit about the works on show and touching on how they relate to unlearning with the land. One thing that I would like to touch upon and pose to all of you is each of you have touched on an embodied learning and how this learning isn't just rooted within your practice, but actually, it isn't just rooted within one body of work, but it's rooted in your practice, and actually you live this embodiment. And I wanted to ask about the effect of embodied learning on time, on the time that you need to make the work, but also how the body operates in each of your practices. I wonder if anyone would like to pick that up?
I mean, go on.
No, go on. No, go on.
I'm just going to, I guess I'm almost finishing a thought in that it slows down my practice a lot when I realised how long it was going to take me to learn something. And it made me, in a way that I kind of retained a bit of work much more with seasonality, in a way that obviously my dad always has, because it's very tied to working with the land and farm work. But it meant, for example, I wanted to use plant-based developer, but there was literally nothing green. There was nothing yet kind of sprouting. So the residency kind of spanned this period from which there was nothing, and it was just bare trees and snow, to things starting to shoot up. So I feel like different things became possible at different moments because of the environment. And I really chimed with Hannah talking about kind of looking what's there in your location and not trying to extract and bring things from elsewhere, but looking around and kind of responding to what's that moment is possible.
And I think that relationship also re-grounds yourself as being part of nature, like we need to allow things to, whether it's the sun to come out for a process or whether it's things to grow and I think that also in a way roots ourselves, as not needing to always be, in this very kind of synthesized digital environment where we don't realize that we also have our own cyclical nature. And our relationship with that in nature. So I think that embodiedness of working, as Rowan says, really seasonally and actually much more locally as well, and just thinking about, okay, what is this space, what's the time of year, what's the temperature, all of these things, and how do they play into your practice also plays into you as an artist and how you are, with kind of like on this earth.
Yeah. Nice. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's always a conflict to me. It's like I know things take a long time. I've learned that now. I have to accept that. But there's always a conflict because part of me wants to just go in and make this work. Like it all happens, and there is always a feeling of trying to rush something. But I've definitely learned that, and I learned that specifically sometimes when there's community projects or call-outs and they say, oh, we're looking for an artist and we've got this a 1 month period to land in a community like a spaceship and then produce this work with them and then do an exhibition. And I used to apply for those, and I used to be like, oh, you can do it. But I've learned that I probably need at least a year to figure out what's in a space, figure out what material can be gathered together, because we're not just process-based. Within all of our practices, we're process-based, but we're trying to bring that into some framework, some aesthetic. And that's a really key conversation that takes time. But also that you're responding, that you're always kind of there, but totally unraveling based on like what is happening in the landscape, what is happening in the conversations with the people you're working with. And trust. Trust takes a lot of time when you land into a different community, like for people to actually, know you're not just in there to rush something and take, this is making together. So, that balance takes time, I think.
Thank you. On that note, but Josh, you spoke about the role of the human hand in relation to the land, and then Rowan, you spoke about the sealing of the wound. And I guess that just made me think of kind of this idea of caring, but then kind of also with Hannah's work, taking the material comes from the land, you extract it, but then I guess with the purpose of taking care of it and not releasing toxic, or as little toxic as possible. So then that made me think about kind of to what do you see the land as a collaborator in that way, as a facilitator, both for your practices and the process of learning? Like, what role does the land play within your practice?
Shall I go first?
Okay.
I mean, I always see it as a collaborator because I'm responding to a site. So whether that's a rewilding site or whether that's where we worked with the Canal and River Trust in Tottenham, you're responding to the water, to ancient practices and votive offerings that existed there as well. Also, where we did the sort of final workshop and performance, had a kind of ancient history of ceremony there as well. So those kind of things I'm longing for. I'm trying to find those out in the land to start a conversation. But that also exists in places which don't really have such a strong sense of landscape in them. Like last year I worked in a hospital for a year as a resident artist. But there, in the middle of the hospital space at St. George's, there's a garden space. And it's kind of this one space that you're boundaried and you're contained. So there you're sort of listening out of like, what space is going to allow this work to happen? What space is going to allow something to sort of develop from this? So it is a deep listening in that sense.
Yeah, I'd also always see the like as working with the land or as a collaborator, as Josh says. I think, its part varies depending on where you are and whether you're making work in your studio or whether you are in a location or whether you're with a specific community or whether you're just doing, a workshop for a day and you're in a new place, which is often the case with my work. I'm often going into new spaces and, constantly kind of trying to think quite immediately of, okay, what's the relevance of this workshop? It might be a workshop that I've taught, like 20 times, but what's the relevance of it here in this space and for these people? And I think it's always really important to think in that way and it not just be the same tool, but actually how its relationship with the people and where you are varies and shapes and shifts what you do. It might be ever so minute, but I think those kind of nuances are really important. And even if, you know, you're just working in your studio, I think it's still, you know, whether it's materials that you've brought in or whether it's just thoughts and research that you're doing, it's always still a process of you getting to know the land more and your dialogue with it and your relationship with it. So it's definitely always in communion, but that form takes many different shapes, I think.
Yeah, I guess I would say my engagement with the land, particularly in this project, was like a return to the land, not as a kind of return, but a remembering maybe, and a remembering of other relationships to land, which are not based on ownership or occupation. So, for example, tree farming, fruit tree farming, is very itinerant. My family have never owned any land. It's always been rented or borrowed, because you actually have to move every couple of years to keep the soil regenerating. So you're on the move, and so it becomes this very, again, to bring up care, very caring, think of caring relationship to the land, because the land is going to care for you in return. And I think for me this is such a political issue, not least in Scotland, where although we have, probably people know about, we have these really great right to roam laws, which means that you can supposedly walk anywhere, go on any land, but we have the worst in the entire world, I believe, the worst land ownership patterns in terms of the most land is owned by the least people. And land is power. Owning land is power. So I'm interested in cultivating and remembering these other relationships to land that don't rely on ownership, at the same time like being critical and looking at ways that we can actually get the land back, I guess, is also something I'm very interested in. So, yeah. And another thing about the land is a collaborator, but as I said to Vicky several times, that like the land is us, like, and we are the land. Like, there's no separation, and that's not about rural landscapes. That's about in this room right now, who owns the land that we're sitting in, like, and who benefits from it.
Yeah. There's something for me about tapping into the learning that you have in the context of the land, and how that, again, how you said it's embodied, that learning is held within you. Or I'm wondering how the knowledge gained from the land, how that is exchanged. Each of you have, I want to say a teaching practice, even though the word teaching is annoying for me for some reason, but that's not this talk, that's a different talk. Catch me later for that one.
Teaching is annoying talk.
Yeah, but educating, working to pass on the learning that you've got, you know, in the context of your work, Rowan, the way that the work is literally situated. Actually, each of you, the aesthetic kind of performs the learning in the viewer. So I move from being a passive viewer. When I first encounter your work, Rowan, I immediately, you know, I'm hit with this wall of green. Then I am focusing on the ceramic pieces and kind of the twists of the ceramic moving around. And it isn't unless I spend more time actively looking and engaging with the work that I am afforded access to the photographs. But one of the things that I really was interested in is how I then become the ceramic branch. Like, I find myself contorting and twisting. And so, yeah, there's something about how my body is positioned via the work. Similarly to yours, Josh, when I think about the seeds and the idea of giving back, I become the seed, and then I am given back to the land. I break down. And so there's a dissolve in the boundaries and borders of my body, and a slippage. I kind of become more porous, and I'm letting this land learning in. And again, with yours, Hannah, I feel the land representing itself. I'm seeing through the lens or through the materiality of the land, and I feel closer to that thing, because photography is, in a lot of different ways, a taking. And there are loads of parallels drawn between the act of photography, you know, thinking about Fox Talbot and thinking about the pencil of nature, where actually photography really isn't a natural process. I mean, back in the origins of photography, they thought that was the closest they were going to get. But as I'm seeing within each of your practices, there's a distinct move towards actually bridging the gap between photography and land and nature. I don't think there was a question in there.
It was great.
Thanks. Yeah. But any questions that came out of that for you guys? I suppose.
I was definitely thinking about the process, because what you were saying I relate to as well. I mean, I think there's always a process of going to a place and responding to it, but there was also a point where you have to throw yourself into the landscape as well. The strongest example I've had of that was last year, the project I did with river swimmers working in the River Cam, was that I was walking along the river trying to find people to take part in this project and this collaboration and stuff, but I hadn't actually got in the river. So I hadn't actually I hadn't actually taken a swim. And I just thought, isn't that so crazy? It's like, you're going along here, you've got this whole project, and there's a distance still between you and actually the work you're making. And it, you know, it sounds a bit dramatic, but it was actually the point that I got in the water and took a swim and didn't really worry about the project. I was just having a swim, you know, and or I could read a book on Roger Deakin about swimming and wild swimming. It is Roger Deakin, isn't it? Yeah, swimming, and read about it, but actually not doing it. And I think it's that thing of throwing yourself into the experience of something and not standing and distant because
But I think that's something to be said quite broadly about photography and what the camera so easily does. I mean, personally, that's why I moved away from, using a camera in a way, because I just felt like it was this huge separator between me and what I was trying to communicate. So for me, like really early on, I very quickly moved away from using a camera at all, and actually, handling the materials and making the camera and having to be the shutter and having to embody all of these things with the landscape was just made so much sense for me. Like the act of sitting behind a lens and looking through an apparatus was just never doing the thing that I wanted to do for me. And so I think what some of your comments touched upon, this idea of what is that relationship between more traditional photography and the land, and is the way that we're working, is it because we feel like more traditional forms of photography aren't able to bridge that gap?
Yeah, that's a very good point. At this point, we would absolutely love to open out this platform to the audience to see if anybody has any questions. If anybody would like, there's a roving mic, so if you can hold your question until the mic arrives at you, that would be phenomenal. Thank you.
There's one over there.
Thank you.
Hi, I really like the presentations and the talks, and empathize a lot because I also teach and I work with materials in a very similar way. I'm wondering if, in spite of all this connection with the land, what do we lose by foregrounding land, and what could we get if we foreground water instead? Because in terms of the materiality, it would make a lot of difference if we don't circumscribe ourselves to the terminology, right? This comes from my experience of working with rivers as well. I've done a lot of work near the River Lee. I'm sorry we never met, but maybe we'll meet next time.
Yeah.
So learning from water, and reading from hydrofeminists, for example, gave me a new, I'm not new, but let's say an experience of the world that is also that of photography, because I think photography, in spite of everything, it's a liquid experience as well as being powdery, but of course it's very liquid. So it's just a challenge. What would we get from foregrounding water in our approach, conceptually and materially?
Good question.
I mean, I personally don't see water as separate, I guess, from, you know, words are always difficult. They don't always communicate what we want to represent. And, you know, the way that we talk about, Rowan talks about our bodies also being the land and the land being within us. I think we're what is it, mostly made up of water. And I think water is, you know, obviously takes up the majority of this planet that we live on, and I just see it all as one big cycle, and I wouldn't necessarily separate the two. You know, water permeates through the rocks and it goes into our rivers, and it's always in relation and part of the land. So I think that your question is really interesting, but for me, I struggle to, I guess, see water as separate from, I see it all part of.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really interesting question as well, because it's this, I think in a way they're similar things. I think they identify how hard we have to work now to actually get out into the land, you know, go on a walk or do a wild swim, especially in the city. You have to work a little bit harder to fit these into our schedule. I certainly find it hard to get away from my laptop, you know, it's like pulling myself away. But for me, they become similar ways of finding voice. Certainly when I worked with river swimmers, it was about kind of a loss of language. It was more about sound, like getting in the water and the sounds that made, or the impact that had on your body, or the memory it gave you, the things we don't know that are in us, things we can't actually access. You mentioned remembering. I think in the landscape, I think whether it's land or water, the connection between the two, they're ways of remembering, but we have to work hard to do it now. You know, we have to actually work. I see a lot of those people that were swimming, they were really sort of pushing themselves to do it early in the morning, and then finding a kind of voice that came out, but it was totally unexpected, and very different for each person.
I guess I would just add that as someone who works outdoors a lot of the time growing things, water is becoming, I guess it always has been a major concern, but it's becoming more and more of a concern. I don't know if anyone does any growing, but you'll know that we have periods of drought now in the UK and in Scotland, which make it just changes, thinking of body embodiment and labour, it changes the nature of your work, because you're suddenly having to think about how to get water, how to transport water. On the flip side, the area that I was working in gets flooded very regularly, so that's a whole other concern, not just for homes and houses, but also for crops and plants and growing in forests and everything. So I think I would agree that for me, I've never considered land and water separate, but I think mapping those connections and the way in which maybe earth and water are completely codependent on each other. And water is, I think, going to become even more and more important, I think, as we go forward into kind of the climate emergency. So yeah, I really appreciate you bringing it up, and I also really enjoy the hydrofeminist kind of theories and ideas, so thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I realized I did make a conscious divide between water and the land, because I was like, I don't really have a relationship with the land, but actually I go swimming in the sea. And there's something in my body that feels significantly better when I do that. Like, it's like I was always meant to be in the sea. I don't know why I'm on the land. It's sort of like I should be in the water all the time. I can't. That's the one moment I feel I get to reconnect. And I'm really grateful to Ellie, a friend who is always there with me, like, encouraging me to get in the sea, even though I always feel like I come out and I don't have any feet. It's awful.
I don't know how you do it in the temperatures that you do.
All year round. It's great. It's like a reset, and I'm like, oh yeah, I've just been reborn again, and I feel like every part of me is alive, and it like wipes away all the brain fog, and it's like a reset. It's just so beautiful. But yeah, I did divide those two out. I would like to fuse them back together. I also think they're one. Yes, I'd love to graph them back together. Well done.
Is there anyone else that has a question? I'm just conscious of time.
Yeah.
Yes, one more there.
Thank you.
Thank you for your sharing. So I think many of you, the work that you share are actually 3D objects, but some of you may consider the photography as your final work. So I'm just wondering, how do you see this relationship between like the 3D objects that you made and photography as a flat surface, and how this relationship informs your relationship with the land as well? Thank you.
Great question.
I guess I'm always interested, even a flat print on a wall, framed or not framed, or a digital image on a screen has depth and is a 3D object in itself. So I'm always interested in this objectness of photograph. Obviously, I have built that out and been working with ceramics for quite some time with photography. And I guess for me, this work in particular, and the period of time, which was actually over a year, the photography became more of a bit of a, I don't want to say a notebook, but it was almost like a way of receiving impressions. And I was never sure that I was going to show any images at all. And I ended up doing it, but in this way that kind of like slightly, I don't know, underplayed them. Yeah, and I actually received some kind of, maybe not criticism, but some discussion around, are you kind of hiding the images? You're kind of like, they deserve to be seen. And actually, I was like, no, but I'd rather they were felt. I would rather they were touched or sensed or smelled or all these other things that photography can do. It's not just this visual flattening of the world. So this is almost like a definitely work in progress, but this was a moment in me like just playing with actually how can photography be more like a body, maybe.
I think I've always seen photography quite physically, not necessarily as a flat surface as you describe it. I think, we're bombarded by a lot of, photography on screens or on phones or on, and photography can mean so much, but, ultimately it's just a reaction of light. And so that doesn't inherently mean that it's a flat surface or that it's a printed representational image. And so I think it's easy to think of photography as one thing, but it can expand into these other dimensions. And I also think that we just generally, as artists, we need to not worry so much about defining ourselves as being a, sculptor, a ceramicist, a photographer. At the end of the day, what we're interested in is, using these tools to communicate ideas and to explore things, within ourselves and touch other people, and that's what's important. It doesn't really matter, what medium you're using or how you define yourself, and I think it partly stems from the way that a lot of our kind of education is structured. We go into individual classes and we learn about one thing, and we don't have that dynamic relationship of how everything fuses together. And I'm quite often, because of the way my work has gone, I'm quite often asked whether I studied chemistry, or whether I did science. And I was awful at science at school. And the reason I was able to suddenly engage with chemistry and engage with science is because it suddenly had this huge relevance for me, and it all tied into my work. And I still, I just see myself as, I guess, an artist or a maker, and I don't think you need to worry so much about whether it's chemistry or photography or sculpture or whatever it is. It's just a way of communicating these ideas, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's important that, for me anyway, that kind of I've never really been able to define myself. This difficulty with being a photographer, is, especially within community work, that because you're responding, loads of different processes come into each workshop, and it's about being open to whether that is photographic, whether that becomes ceramic, and whether that becomes 16mm. But it is really interesting how quickly you become identified. I mean, in the hospital last year, I started painting. You know, I started doing bits of painting, or then suddenly I was doing poetry. And every ward I went on, they would say, "Oh, the painter's here," and then they would say, "Oh no, the poet's here today." And I was like, "Oh, I'm a poet today. I'm a painter." And then I think they even called me the balloon man, because some kid was like, "Are you the balloon man?" And making the dogs. And I was like, "I'm really sorry to disappoint you. I'm actually the artist." And he was like, "Oh." So, I'm happy to be the balloon man as well. It just depends on what the space needs.
That's beautiful. Well, I just want to thank you guys ever so much. That is our time. We will be hanging around a bit, so if you would like to catch any of us for a little extended conversation, please do. And
please, if you haven't had a chance to go upstairs to the exhibition, to see the works that we've discussed today and the rest of the show, it'd be great to see you up there. Thank you for your questions, and enjoy the rest of the program.
Thank you very much.